Hello and welcome back to Z Sci-Fi Stories. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep the lights on and our team paid. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1, so our writers and editors can pay their living expenses and keep bringing these universes to life. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description or the comments below. Let me tell you a secret about the void. When the alien empires look at the stars, they see territory. When humanity looks at the stars, we see raw materials. The older races waited for humanity to scream when the crystalline fleet arrived to slaughter us. They waited for us to broadcast our terror into the endless dark. But the humans did not make a single sound. The galaxy mistook that absolute silence for cowardice, failing to understand that humanity was simply taking a deep breath, loading an entire solar system into the chamber. Eduardo Bryson possessed the kind of face that perfectly mirrored the dead worlds he walked upon. At 50 years old, his skin was a rugged, topographical map of radiation scars and deep stress lines. His eyes carried the heavy, bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had spent his entire adult life forcing oxygen into the lungs of lifeless stone. He was not a soldier. He was the chief terraforming engineer of the Hephaestus, a vessel that possessed absolutely zero elegance. She was a flying industrial accident, an ugly, asymmetrical behemoth of a ship groaning under the immense physical weight of heavy machinery. The Hephaestus carried millions of tons of caustic chemicals, temperamental plasma reactors, and colossal atmospheric generators that could swallow a city block. She was a stubborn workhorse designed to crack tectonic plates, melt ice caps, and boil frozen oceans until they breathed. Because of this, she possessed no energy shields. She carried no military-grade weapons. The ship and her crew of 80 were simply doing their job in the suffocating, pitch-black isolation of an uncharted fringe system, operating far beyond the safety of Earth's military patrols. The only sounds aboard were the rhythmic thumping of the circulation pumps and the low, heavy hum of the fusion drives pushing them through the dark. The dark ocean of space offered absolutely no warning when the Kryn fleet ripped out of the void. They did not decelerate into the sector. They simply manifested, slicing through the vacuum like diamond razors through silk. The Kryn were an empire composed entirely of silicate crystals and hard light energy. They were a predatory, apex species that viewed the universe as their divine slaughterhouse. Their destroyers were terrifyingly beautiful, boasting perfect geometric symmetry and glowing with a sterile, blinding luminescence that hurt the human eye. They possessed firepower capable of shattering small moons and boiling seas in a matter of seconds. A transmission forced its way into the command deck of the Hephaestus, cutting through the static with a voice that sounded like grinding glass and freezing wind. The Kryn commander did not offer a greeting. "Attention, carbon-based infestation. You have trespassed into a sacred hunting domain. Self-destruct your propulsion engines immediately and eject your primary energy cores. We do not tolerate the presence of biological filth in this sector. Surrender your warmth or be eradicated." Eduardo barely had the time to reach for the communications relay before the Kryn demonstrated their brutal definition of a warning. A lance of pure, concentrated thermal energy struck the Hephaestus. It did not target the engines to disable them. It punched straight through the reinforced titanium hull of Chemical Containment Bay, No. 4. The resulting vacuum was instantaneous and utterly unforgiving. The bulkhead sensors shrieked as explosive decompression ripped through the entire starboard sector. 8 terraforming engineers, men and women Eduardo had shared synthetic coffee with just 20 minutes prior, were vaporized in a blinding flash of boiling ammonia and hard vacuum. There was no time for them to scream. There was no opportunity for negotiation. The Kryn did not understand the concept of mercy. They only understood the absolute dominion of light over fragile matter. The command bridge of the Hephaestus was suddenly bathed in the harsh, strobing red glare of emergency alarms. The klaxons tore at Eduardo's eardrums, serving as a mechanical death rattle for his murdered crew. He stood completely still before the primary console, his calloused hands gripping the edge of the metal terminal until his knuckles turned entirely white. He stared at the casualty feed scrolling rapidly on his monitor. 8 flat lines. 8 friends reduced to frozen stardust drifting into the void. Out there in the black, the Kryn commander waited in silence, fully expecting the frantic, pathetic surrender codes of a helpless freighter. They expected the humans to bow. Eduardo Bryson exhaled a long, ragged breath that fogged the glass of his display. He did not reach for the surrender broadcast. He did not call for help. Instead, his heavy fingers danced across the manual overrides of the central engineering terminal, bypassing the civilian safety locks one by one. "Seal all internal bulkheads," Eduardo commanded, his voice carrying the cold, terrifying weight of a dead world. "Divert all life support from the outer rings. Lock down the primary reactors and initiate terraforming protocol level Omega." The crystalline destroyers of the Kryn fleet aligned in perfect, terrifying synchronization. Their hard light weapon batteries charged, drawing energy from the void itself, preparing to deliver the final execution strike. A second shot would crack the Hephaestus right down its heavy titanium spine. Aboard the human vessel, the deck vibrated violently. Warning lights painted the engineering bay in frantic strokes of crimson. Eduardo Bryson did not flinch. He ripped open the heavy physical access panel of the primary nuclear reactor core, his hands moving with the desperate precision of a man who had nothing left to lose. He gripped the heavy manual control rods, hauling them back to physically sever the safety regulators. He was not arming a weapon. He was weaponizing the raw, unfettered power of creation itself. "Divert all atmospheric terraforming payload to the exterior exhaust manifolds," Eduardo roared over the deafening mechanical wail of the ship. "Purge the entire atmospheric reserve." The Hephaestus shuddered violently, as if struck by a massive asteroid. Along the scarred, ugly flanks of the colossal ship, dozens of massive industrial exhaust vents violently blew their seals. In less than 3 seconds, millions of tons of supercompressed hydrogen gas and liquid oxygen were violently expelled directly into the vacuum of space. The depressurization was so immense that it created an artificial gravitational pull for a brief moment. The chemicals expanded exponentially in the zero-gravity environment, instantly forming a dense, swirling artificial nebula. The sheer volume of the gas was incomprehensible. It swallowed the space around them, completely engulfing the pristine, glowing armada of the Kryn Empire in a thick, chaotic fog of freezing vapor and swirling molecules. Panic, a sensation completely foreign to the crystalline apex predators, rippled through the Kryn communication networks. Their advanced optical sensors and hard light targeting arrays were entirely dependent on the clear, unobstructed spectrum of the vacuum. Now, plunged into the dense, churning heart of a crude atmospheric soup, their lasers scattered. Their sensors returned only static. For the very first time in their long, ruthless history, the ultimate hunters of the galaxy had been completely blinded by a sluggish, unarmed cargo freighter. But the absolute darkness was only the beginning of Eduardo's wrath. He stood before the main console, his hand hovering over a heavy switch encased in reinforced glass. It was the trigger for the planetary core igniter, a monumental piece of terraforming equipment designed to fire a concentrated beam of raw plasma straight into the mantle of dead, frozen ice worlds to jumpstart their molten hearts. "Let there be light," Eduardo whispered, and slammed his fist down onto the trigger. The Hephaestus unleashed the plasma igniter. The blindingly bright, superheated beam of energy shot directly into the center of the dense hydrogen and oxygen cloud. The resulting chemical reaction defied the silent, cold nature of the universe. The nebula ignited, with the immense volume of pure oxygen acting as a catalyst. The hydrogen detonated in a cosmic firestorm of apocalyptic proportions. An ocean of aggressive, roaring yellow and orange flame erupted in the dead of space, creating a brief, localized sun. Two of the sleek, arrogant Kryn destroyers were caught dead center in the epicenter of the inferno. Their silicate armor was designed to deflect elegant laser fire and energy beams. But it was absolutely useless against the brute force, physical thermal shock of a raw chemical explosion. The intense heat caused their crystalline hulls to expand rapidly, and the sheer kinetic pressure of the expanding gas wave crushed them. In the span of a single heartbeat, the two magnificent warships shattered into a billion burning shards of glass, completely incinerated by the raging tempest of human industrial engineering. The Hephaestus was right on the edge of the blast radius. The colossal shockwave slammed into the rear of the terraforming ship, buckling its aft armor plating and melting its communication arrays. But Eduardo had calculated the trajectory. He did not try to outrun the explosion. He rode it. The immense kinetic force of the fiery shockwave acted as a massive thruster, propelling the battered, burning Hephaestus forward at speeds its engines could never achieve alone. Trailing smoke, leaking coolant, and battered beyond recognition, the heavy ship plunged headfirst into the chaotic sanctuary of a nearby dense asteroid belt. Its thermal signature faded entirely, lost amidst the churning rocks and the fading embers of the artificial sun they had left behind. Back in the clearing void, the surviving Kryn commander drifted in stunned. Absolute silence. Their perfectly orchestrated execution had turned into a catastrophic massacre. They compiled the sensor data, the visual records of the roaring flames, and the structural analysis of their shattered brethren. They transmitted the grim report back to the Crystal Heart, the homeworld of their empire. When the High Council of the Kryn received the data, they did not feel awe. They did not feel the icy grip of fear. They felt an overwhelming, blistering humiliation. That a primitive, carbon-based species using nothing but crude mining tools and atmospheric gas could destroy their sacred vessels was an insult that demanded the extinction of an entire civilization. The Emperor of the Kryn issued a singular, absolute directive. They declared a total purge war against humanity. There would be no negotiations. There would only be dust. When the Kryn Empire officially broadcasted their decree of absolute extermination across the galactic communication arrays, a profound, chilling shudder rippled through the civilized spiral arms. The older, established civilizations, particularly the esteemed members of the Council of Observers, settled into their grand amphitheaters and waited for the inevitable spectacle. They had witnessed this exact scenario play out countless times before, over the eons. They fully expected the young, fragile human race to flood the interstellar relays with frantic, desperate pleas for military intervention. The council members anticipated tearful diplomatic broadcasts from Earth, desperate apologies, and pathetic offers of heavy resource tribute to stave off complete annihilation. But the human response defied every established protocol of galactic warfare. There was no grand, emotional speech broadcasted from the high command on Earth. There were absolutely no diplomatic envoys dispatched to beg for mercy. Instead, the infamously noisy and chaotic human-civilian communication network abruptly cut all broadband transmissions. The constant chatter of trade ships, orbital stations, and mining colonies vanished in a single, synchronized instant. The galaxy listened closely, but humanity did not make a single sound. It was not the silence of the defeated dead. It was the terrifying, heavy quiet of a massive, industrial machine calculating its next mechanical strike. Hidden alien intelligence operatives stationed near the borders of human space began transmitting frantic, deeply confused reports back to their respective homeworlds. They were witnessing a logistical mobilization that made absolutely no tactical sense to any traditional military mind. Humanity was not rallying its modest naval fleet. They were completely ignoring their orbital defense shipyards. Instead, the Earth bureaucracy was requisitioning heavy industry on an incomprehensible scale. Hundreds of thousands of civilian engineering vessels were violently pulled from their commercial routes. Colossal comet miners designed to crack open celestial bodies. Heavy radiation compressors, built to harvest raw solar energy. And massive atmospheric shapers were abruptly redirected toward the contested borders. A universal military draft was enacted across all human colonies, but it did not call for standard soldiers. The bureaucracy mobilized millions of blue-collar workers, men and women in oil-stained coveralls, deep core drillers, and heavy machinery engineers received immediate deployment orders. They were not issued standard plasma rifles or combat armor. They were simply told to keep operating their exact same industrial equipment, but with a horrifying new directive. They were ordered to put their terraforming machines into reverse. Blinded by their own crystalline arrogance and eager for slaughter, the massive Kryn armada poured into human territorial waters like a tidal wave of shattered glass. They encountered painfully minimal resistance. The sparse, lightly armed Earth patrol squadrons engaged them only briefly before completely folding, scattering into the blackness of space like frightened insects fleeing a heavy boot. The majestic Kryn destroyers pushed deep into the outer rim systems, claiming frozen planet after frozen planet without sustaining a single structural scratch. They marched forward with absolute, intoxicating overconfidence, their hard light weapons sweeping empty asteroid fields and abandoned outposts. Aboard the glowing command deck of the primary flagship, the leading Kryn general reviewed the tactical holographic projections with a sense of utter boredom. He transmitted a formal audio declaration back to the Crystal Heart. "The vermin scatter before our light," the general announced, his tone devoid of any respect for the enemy. "I calculate this minor purge will be completely finished in exactly 3 months." The general, born into a culture of honorable, direct energy combat, completely lacked the capacity to understand the concept of an industrial tactical retreat. He failed to realize that the humans were not running away in terror. They were actively, carefully pulling the entire Kryn armada deeper into a meticulously designated zone. The Empire firmly believed they were conquering helpless, abandoned territory. In reality, they were being methodically herded directly into an interstellar construction site, completely unaware that the blue-collar architects of Earth had already rigged the very fabric of the star system to break them into dust. The chase finally culminated in the immense gravitational shadow of the Aegis system. Aegis was a dying red giant, a bloated, decaying star burning through the very last of its heavy elements, casting a sickly, bruised magenta light across the barren, frozen planets trapped in its decaying orbit. It was in this desolate graveyard of a system that the primary Kryn armada finally cornered the ragged remnants of the human military escorts. Alongside the colossal, battered Hephaestus and a massive swarm of repurposed civilian engineering vessels, the majestic silicate destroyers fanned out into a perfect, inescapable crescent formation, completely boxing the humans against the massive thermal wall of the sun. They charged their hard light cannons, ready to deliver the final killing stroke to the biological pests that had dared to embarrass their empire. Aboard the human flagship, Eduardo Bryson stood heavily at the helm, watching the tactical displays illuminate his weathered face. He did not look at the glowing enemy armada. His tired, heavy eyes were fixed solely on the raging, unstable surface of the dying sun looming behind them. The communications channel crackled with the rough voices of thousands of foremen, heavy drill operators, and mining rig captains waiting for their shift to begin. "All units," Eduardo spoke into the general frequency, his voice completely devoid of any battle cry or heroic bravado. "Clock in, tap the furnace." The human fleet did not launch a single missile at the glowing crystalline armada. They completely ignored the enemy warships locking onto their hulls. Instead, Thousands of heavy comet miners, core extractors, and atmospheric processors synchronized their targeting computers and fired their massive payloads directly into the volatile heart of the Aegis star. Heavy gravity tethers, industrial tools normally used to drag rogue moons into new orbits, violently pierced the star's outer chromosphere. Deep core plasma drills, designed to tap the mantle of frozen planets, plunged deep into the unstable photosphere of the dying giant. They were aggressively force-feeding a collapsing star. The Kryn commanders watched this display in utter confusion. Their sophisticated tactical algorithms could not process the strategic value of shooting at a celestial body during an active naval engagement. The general of the Kryn fleet scoffed, assuming the fragile human minds had finally succumbed to mass hysteria and panic under the pressure of their inevitable doom. With supreme arrogance, he ordered his gunners to open fire and sweep the trash from the void. He was exactly 5 seconds too late. Humanity had mastered the delicate, immensely violent art of quantum ecological manipulation. By injecting localized, hyper-dense gravity wells and raw, dark matter directly into the fusion layer of the dying red giant, the civilian engineers created an artificial cascading failure within the belly of the star. Aegis violently convulsed. The massive celestial body shuddered under the sudden, agonizing subatomic pressure. Then, guided by the immense magnetic tethers of the human construction fleet acting as a barrel, the star erupted. It was not a random solar event. It was a perfectly directed, weaponized coronal mass ejection. A monumental tsunami of superheated plasma and hyper-concentrated ultraviolet radiation tore away from the sun. It was a localized solar flare of apocalyptic proportions, shaped and focused by the gravity tethers into a colossal, sweeping tidal wave of raw cosmic fury. It surged across the vacuum, crossing the distance between the sun and the Kryn fleet in a matter of terrifying, blinding moments. The Kryn warships were universally recognized as invincible against conventional kinetic ballistics and standard thermal lasers. Their hard light shields and silicate crystalline armor could effortlessly deflect the wrath of 1,000 dreadnoughts. But they had never been designed to withstand the unbridled, point-blank vomiting of a tortured star. When the massive solar wave crashed into the flawless, symmetric formation, the result was a symphony of absolute, devastating destruction. The intense, hyper-focused ultraviolet radiation penetrated the hard light shields as if they were made of thin vapor. The concentrated radiation began to aggressively interact with the complex silicate structures of the Kryn hulls. It was a matter of brutal quantum resonance. The specific destructive frequencies of the dying star caused the crystal armor of the alien ships to vibrate violently at a subatomic level. Across the void, the beautiful, glowing warships began to scream. Microfractures spiderwebbed across their pristine surfaces, spreading like a plague of shattered glass. Then, the thermal overload hit. The sudden, impossible spike in heat caused the resonating crystals to expand far beyond their physical limits. Whole sections of the majestic destroyers simply exploded outward, shattering into millions of blinding, jagged splinters. Massive cruisers that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries crumbled like dry leaves thrown into an industrial furnace, their glowing energy cores extinguishing in the blinding white wash of the heavy solar storm. Absolute suffocating despair descended upon the Kryn command network. The surviving alien captains realized with mounting, paralyzed horror that the humans were not fighting a naval battle. The humans had turned the entire solar system into an industrial oven, and the Kryn were trapped on the roasting rack. They could not shoot back at a solar flare. They could not outmaneuver a wave of solid radiation that spanned millions of miles across the dark. The supposed apex predators of the galaxy were being casually exterminated by men in soiled work clothes, wielding the physical mechanics of the universe itself. Aboard his crumbling flagship, the Kryn general watched the crystalline ceiling of his command deck splinter and crack, raining sharp dust onto his glowing form. His visual sensors were completely overwhelmed by the blinding light of the weaponized sun tearing his fleet apart. The arrogant certainty that had defined his entire existence, and the existence of his empire, evaporated in an instant. It was replaced by a primal, crushing terror. His invincible armada was disintegrating into floating ash. If he maintained their pride for even 60 more seconds, there would be absolutely nothing left of his people but glittering dust drifting in the solar winds. With trembling, cracked appendages, the general bypassed his own paralyzed tactical officers and manually keyed the universal civilian broadcast frequency. He transmitted the unconditional surrender codes, immediately dropping his remaining hard-light shields to signal absolute submission to the engineers. Eduardo Bryson stood perfectly still as he watched the surrender transmission scroll across his battered monitor. He raised a heavy, calloused hand, signaling the sprawling fleet of workers. "Cut the tethers," Eduardo commanded quietly. "Cap the well." The human engineering ships instantly severed their magnetic links and powered down their gravity drills. The dying star, no longer being artificially agitated by the terraformers, slowly began to settle back into its natural, bloated decay. The deadly wave of radiation dissipated into the endless black, leaving behind a massive, glittering graveyard of shattered crystal and dead engines. Only 30% of the Grand Kryn Armada remained intact, and even those surviving vessels were heavily scarred, completely disabled, and drifting helplessly in the dark. Humanity dispatched heavy, ugly cargo haulers to clamp onto the dead alien warships like tow trucks, hauling the surviving commanders into the cold, industrial brigs of their processing ships. In a single, devastating shift, the mechanical fire of human ingenuity had utterly incinerated the ancient pride of the Kryn Empire. The holding cell deep within the bowels of the heavy processing ship was a masterclass in sensory deprivation. It was a cold, brutalist cube of reinforced steel, illuminated only by a single harsh, humming fluorescent tube. Eduardo Bryson sat on a bolted iron chair, his heavy, calloused hands resting on the metal table. Across from him sat the captive Kryn general. The alien was a pitiful shadow of the glowing, majestic entity that had commanded the extermination fleet. Its once brilliant silicate body was dull, heavily fractured, and leaking a sluggish, dim light from a dozen deep fissures. The sheer physical trauma of the solar flare had shattered its physical arrogance, leaving only the fragile core of a broken creature. Eduardo stared at the captive for a long, heavy moment before finally speaking. "You ordered the slaughter of my crew without a single word of warning," Eduardo said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that echoed off the bare walls. "You declared a purge war on our entire species. And yet, your tactical formations were sloppy. Your resource lines were stretched completely thin. You did not fight like an empire expanding its borders. You fought like cornered animals. Why?" The Kryn general shifted its cracked, jagged head. The translation matrix collar clamped around its neck emitted a series of harsh, mechanical clicks before rendering the alien's response into cold, synthesized English. "We did not seek your territory, human. We sought your heat." Eduardo leaned forward, his brow furrowing deep over his tired eyes. "Explain." The alien slumped forward, the dim light in its chest pulsing with a weak, dying rhythm. "The crystal heart, the mother star of our entire civilization. It is dying. It is not expanding into a fiery giant like the star you weaponized against us. It is collapsing into an eternal, suffocating freeze. The core temperature of our homeworld is dropping by the hour. Entire continents of our people are freezing solid, trapped in absolute zero, their consciousness shattering in the dark. We are starving for thermal energy." The revelation hung in the cold air of the interrogation room, heavy and suffocating. The general raised a trembling, splintered appendage, pointing a jagged finger toward Eduardo. "When we detected your heavy terraforming vessel in the outer fringe, we did not see a simple cargo ship. We saw a colossal, moving reactor. We saw millions of tons of refined, compressed energy. We believed your species was hoarding the very fire that could keep our nurseries alive for another generation. The strike on your ship was not a holy execution. It was a desperate theft by a freezing, dying race. We thought you were a rival predator, stealing the last embers in the dark. Eduardo sat back slowly. The air in his lungs felt suddenly dense. The grand, terrifying villains of the galaxy were not imperial conquerors. They were simply freezing to death in the dark, driven to absolute madness by the impending extinction of their own children. This classified intelligence was immediately transmitted via secure quantum relay directly to the Earth Military Command. The response from the high bureaucracy was swift and deeply fractured. The politicians and generals who had spent the last several weeks preparing for an apocalyptic war of survival were suddenly handed the keys to total victory. Human intelligence confirmed the general's confession. The Kryn homeworld was vulnerable, its defensive grids completely starved of power. The orders that came back down the chain of command were ruthless. Exactly 50% of the ruling council demanded an immediate, overwhelming preemptive strike. They ordered the military to jump to the coordinates of the Crystal Heart and glass the planet entirely, wiping out the crippled empire before they could ever pose a threat again. Eduardo stood alone on the observation deck of his battered ship, staring out into the empty blackness. The internal struggle threatened to tear his mind apart. He closed his eyes and vividly saw the flashing red emergency lights of Chemical Bay No. 4. He heard the phantom shriek of explosive decompression. He remembered the 8 men and women who had been vaporized in a fraction of a second, their lives stolen by the very creature he had just interrogated. Revenge was not just possible. It was officially sanctioned by his government. He merely had to step aside and let the military executioners do their work. But Eduardo Bryson was not an executioner. He was not a soldier. He looked down at his rough, scarred hands. For over 30 years, those hands had planted atmospheric generators on barren, toxic rocks. They had carefully balanced tectonic pressures to create warm, stable oceans. His entire existence was defined by a singular, unshakable instinct to breathe life into dead things. The military wanted to use this opportunity to build a graveyard, but a terraforming engineer only knows how to build a garden. Eduardo turned away from the observation window, his decision solidifying like cooled iron. He was about to commit high treason. He marched directly to the engineering communications relay, completely bypassing the secure military channels. He opened a direct, encrypted frequency to the thousands of civilian foremen, deep core drillers, and plasma rig captains still holding formation in the Aegis system. "This is Chief Engineer Bryson," he announced, his voice steady and resolute. "Earth Command has ordered us to stand down and prepare for a military orbital bombardment of the enemy homeworld. We are officially ignoring that order. We are not soldiers, and I refuse to let us become exterminators. Spool up your heavy plasma drills. Overcharge your primary fusion reactors. We are going to do the one thing we were born to do. We are going to go to work." The civilian fleet did not hesitate. In the dark of the void, thousands of heavy industrial engines ignited in perfect, defiant unison, preparing to execute a rogue architectural blueprint that no military mind could ever comprehend. The fabric of the space-time continuum tore wide open directly above the Crystal Heart. It was not a subtle, elegant arrival. It was a violent, jagged rip in the absolute silence of the universe. Tens of thousands of massive, heavily scarred human engineering vessels poured out of the faster-than-light transit corridor, blotting out the stars with their crude, industrial bulk. Officially, the high bureaucracy of Earth Military Command had authorized this movement as Operation Final Purge. They had demanded a preemptive strike of total annihilation to the freezing, desperate citizens looking up from the surface of the Kryn homeworld. The arrival of this colossal mechanical armada looked exactly like the literal end of days. Down below, on the sprawling continents of frozen silicate, billions of crystalline beings fell to their knees in the encroaching frost. Their once luminous bodies were dull and fracturing, crackling with the terminal, agonizing chill of absolute zero. They closed their eyes, wrapping their fragile, shivering appendages around their freezing children. They waited in absolute, terrifying silence for the inevitable rain of atomic fire. They fully expected the ruthless, carbon-based conquerors to glass their remaining cities, accepting it as a fitting, brutal consequence for a war their own empire had foolishly ignited. A heavy, suffocating silence blanketed the entire planet, thick with the expectation of total extinction. High above the atmosphere, in the dimly lit command deck of his battered flagship, Eduardo Bryson looked down at the dying world. He did not look at the glowing military targeting displays that his navigational officers had prepared. He looked past the planet entirely, locking his tired, heavy eyes onto the dimming orb of the Kryn mother star. It was a celestial body gasping its absolute final breaths of warmth, slowly collapsing inward under its own agonizing physical weight. The entire fleet-wide communications channel was perfectly clear, filled only with the static hum of thousands of captains waiting for Eduardo to unleash hell upon the enemy. "This is Chief Engineer Bryson," Eduardo said softly into the universal broadcast, his voice completely devoid of anger or vengeance. "Disengage all weapon systems. Clear all military targeting solutions. Lock your navigation coordinates directly onto the mother star. Initiate protocol genesis." The immense human fleet did not lower its heavy guns toward the helpless, kneeling cities. Instead, in a breathtaking maneuver that completely defied all known military logic across the galaxy, the tens of thousands of heavy civilian ships pitched their colossal noses downward and dove straight past the planet. They ignored the enemy homeworld entirely, accelerating violently toward the freezing, unstable heart of the dying sun. What happened next was not an act of war, nor was it a simple display of dominance. It was the most magnificent, violently beautiful act of industrial salvation the universe had ever witnessed. The human vessels did not attempt to extract the remaining energy from the dying star. They did the exact opposite. As they entered the lethal, crushing gravitational pull of the collapsing giant, the heavy, terraforming ships initiated a synchronized, catastrophic self-sacrifice. They bypassed every single civilian safety limiter built into their hulls, pushing their massive nuclear fusion reactors far beyond critical mass. They were not merely drilling into the star. They were voluntarily giving up their own mechanical hearts. "Fire the payload," Eduardo commanded, gripping the edge of his console. Tens of thousands of heavy plasma drills, loaded with billions of tons of supercompressed hydrogen, liquid helium, and raw ignition matter, were fired simultaneously from the human fleet. The massive projectiles slammed directly into the dead core of the freezing star. Having completely drained their primary power grids to deliver the blow, the human ships immediately went dark. They rode the violent thermal shockwaves backward, drifting helplessly as empty, powerless shells while their colossal payloads plunged deep into the dark, frozen center of the celestial giant. The entire universe seemed to hold its breath. For one long, agonizing minute, absolutely nothing happened. The mother star absorbed the monumental payload of human engineering in complete, terrifying silence. Then, the dead star violently contracted. It pulled inward with a terrifying gravitational shudder that warped the very light around it. And then, it ignited. A blinding, magnificent shockwave of pure, golden light erupted from the deep core. The star did not simply wake up. It roared back to life with the raw, unfettered fury of a billion newly forged furnaces. A colossal wave of thermal energy washed over the Kryn homeworld. It was not a wave of destruction, but a wave of profound, absolute warmth. The eternal frost that had gripped the silicate continents instantly shattered. The thick, suffocating ice melted into rushing rivers of glowing liquid light. The crystal heart was entirely bathed in the glorious, radiant heat of a reborn sun. Humanity had just executed the greatest, most audacious terraforming project in galactic history. They had used their crude mining tools to jump-start a dead star. Down on the surface of the planet, the kneeling Kryn citizens slowly opened their eyes. The terminal freeze that had plagued their bodies was entirely gone. Their crystalline structures began to glow vibrantly once again, eagerly absorbing the rich, life-giving radiation of their resurrected sun. Millions of faces looked up at the sky, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the miracle. Far away, in the cold, dark holding cell aboard the human processing ship, the captive Kryn general fell heavily to his knees. He watched the live feed of his home system bursting with golden light. For the very first time in the long, bloody history of his proud and ruthless species, fluid gathered in his optical sensors. He wept heavy, crystalline tears, completely broken not by the terrifying violence of humanity, but by their incomprehensible, overwhelming mercy. Across the civilized spiral arms of the galaxy, the ancient observing races watched the impossible sensor data roll in, and a profound, chilling realization settled permanently over them. Humanity was not terrifying simply because they possessed the power to destroy. Any primitive race could build a bomb and burn a city. Humanity was terrifying because they possessed the god-like power to manipulate the fundamental mechanics of life and death itself. They could weaponize a dying sun to turn an invincible armada into floating ash, and they could sacrifice their own ships to resurrect a dead world. The Great Purge War did not end with a formally signed treaty, a grand diplomatic summit, or a forced surrender broadcast. It ended in a state of absolute, reverent awe. Eduardo Bryson stood alone on the silent observation deck of his crippled ship, his weathered face bathed in the bright, golden light of the new Kryn sun. He did not look like a triumphant conqueror or a military hero. He just looked like a tired engineer at the end of a very long, very hard shift. He smiled, a quiet, profoundly peaceful expression that smoothed the deep lines of his face. He knew, with absolute certainty, that the tragic, sudden loss of his 8 friends had not been paid for with pointless cosmic ash, but with the eternal, blazing resurrection of an entire civilization. And as he watched the new light dance across the empty void, he knew without a shadow of a doubt that the galaxy would never, ever dare to ambush a ship flying the flag of Earth again. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please let us know down in the comments. If you found today's journey inspiring and would like to help us keep the lights on, please consider supporting our team with just $1. You can scan the PayPal QR code on your screen or use the link provided in the description and the pinned comment. Your kindness directly allows our writers and editors to feed their families and continue crafting these epic universes for you. Thank you, and see you in the next adventure.